Millions of Americans have reached a stage in their intellectual and political development that has compelled them to search for something deeper, something more meaningful, and a much more substantive way of viewing politics in our country. And that is why I believe Vivek Ramaswamy is having such a compelling impact on many millions of people who he is reaching through the airwaves, that he is reaching through the internet and reaching through, of course, in-person events as well. And that's why I believe that he is also, as of the current moment posting of this video, the fastest growing candidate on the GOP Republican primary side, as opposed to every other candidate, post DeSantis, whose numbers are going down every single day, and Trump's, whose numbers actually just stay rather steady, and if they go up marginally. And so that's what brings me to today's video. Vivek recently did a very compelling interview with Tucker Carlson that I think actually can give Americans, independent of this primary race, several lessons that we can learn, not only about ourselves, but about the nature of society and the nature of the world that can benefit us in a manner that goes beyond politics. And as someone himself who studies philosophy, as someone himself who is an advocate of Americanism, the philosophy of America, as someone himself who is a passionate American conservative, I wanted to use this interview as a means of jumping off into exploring those various points. And so I will be taking bits and pieces from this Carlson interview. I will not be reacting to the whole interview because I want you to go support Carlson and go support other independent media, because they are what will bring the Leviathan, which has taken a stranglehold over our media and our government, and it is distorting and twisting narratives to fit their wicked ends. They are the ones taking them on. And so I want you to go support them in their original channels, which will all be in the comment section and the description down below. Without further ado, let us begin analyzing the Vivek Ramaswamy Tucker Carlson interview. Now, Vivek mentioned something in the interview that at the very beginning that is actually quite profound. Carlson asks him about his opinions of 9/11. Now, Vivek said on Alex Stein's Blaze TV show that he believes the 9/11 Commission and the government actually lied about 9/11. This prompted Mike Pence and a bunch of other establishmentarians to attack him and to clutch their pearls and to feign, in my opinion, feign moral outrage at an American questioning the government. What a novel concept, right? As if our country wasn't founded on that sort of righteous resistance and epistemic humility and fortitude, but that's a different topic, different day. We'll get to that later. And so here is what Vivek says about that whole ordeal right here.
That the government absolutely lied to us. The 9/11 Commission lied. The FBI lied. Now, is this a core point of my campaign? No, it's not. I actually went on a comedy show where some guy asked me, was the moon landing fake? I said, I think it was real. Then he asked me, did the government tell us the truth about 9/11? I said, no, they did not. So in response to a question, I'm going to answer honestly.
Yeah.
And the thing I had in mind was the facts. There's this guy, Al-Bayoumi. Now, rewind back to 9/11 and the pre-9/11 day. Think of how ludicrous this story is. A 42-year-old graduate student, and there's nothing wrong with being 42 and going back to school. My dad went back to school much later in life, but he's a 42-year-old graduate student who receives the two of the terrorists who flew planes into buildings in the United States of America not that long later, receives them at the airport in LA, takes them to his house, spends lots of time with them, integrates them into the community. But the account for what he said happened was he met them randomly at the airport. That doesn't make much sense on the face.
Just kind of happened to be at LAX and
no, exactly.
Two guys from
and
Saudi.
Hey, you look like guys we might get along with, and then suddenly become fast friends at the airport, so much so that he takes them up. So it's a little suspicious. But hey, the 9/11 Commission and the FBI looked into it, and at the time they said his account is accurate.
Yeah, it sounds legit.
It sounds super legit, right? Now, there was some
hanging out at LAX.
These guys came from Saudi Arabia. Does this guy who received them have any ties to Saudi Arabia? That's where they landed. But now, 20 years later, in 2021 and 2022, the FBI quietly declassifies documents. And they have to, 20 years later, it's the deadline. That suggests that, oh, wait a minute. They did know, actually, that this guy was a Saudi intelligence operative. So is this the main point I'm focused on in my campaign? No, I'm not. We have to focus on the future of the country. But if I'm asked a question and I answer honestly based on the facts, I don't think they would have come for me if this was false, if this was ludicrous.
Of course.
Lying
is never punished.
Lying is never punished. But it's speaking the truths you're not supposed to speak. That's what actually attracts the immune response, the anaphylaxis.
But why? I mean, you made I thought, a really wonderful point.
Now, here's what I'll say. The facts of what happened at 9/11 and the facts of what the 9/11 Commission did, as Vivek mentioned, are established. They absolutely 100% lied to us, perhaps even about more than just that, but certainly about Saudi involvement in 9/11. In fact, there's been a lot of lawsuits, a lot of investigations into that. But here's the more interesting thing to me, is that what does it mean for our society when an untold amount of people react negatively towards hearing someone question a narrative as close to the heart of the establishment and as close to the past 20 plus years of American political action, both overseas and domestically, like 9/11. Because understand, 9/11 quite literally birthed an entire government agency, the Department of Homeland Security, which has been known for violating the rights of Americans and taking in their data in the name of national security and benevolence. It quite literally birthed $1.2 trillion plus wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other excursions in the Middle East that were undertaken under the umbrella of this nebulous war on terrorism, which the Bush administration used the authorization for the use of military force, which is not a declaration of war, which the Constitution and the War Powers Act requires, but is instead just a blanket authorization for the president to wage war against anything he deems to be terrorism. They use that to perpetuate this war on terrorism, and the defense contractors and the establishment media and the establishment politicians, remember, the New York Times actually supported going into Iraq. All these people were lined up behind these efforts as if their lives and their sustenance depended on it, and as if they had a personal stake, and even an ideological stake, in these countless terrors that have costed thousands of American men and women their lives, and have also ruined our reputation around the world. So 9/11 actually produced a lot of different things. So we have to ask ourselves, what kind of society would not ask a question about such a monumentous thing like that? But even beyond 9/11, because that's like a separate issue. It is a sign of an unhealthy society if you are not allowed to question authority. But I'll go a step further. It is doubly a sign of an unhealthy society if you're not allowed to not just question political authority, but to question the authority of socially erected sacred cows. The narrative surrounding John F. Kennedy's assassination, the narrative surrounding 9/11, the narrative surrounding so many different events that have changed the course and landscape of our republic, they have been held up as sacred cows that if you question, you are somehow a lunatic, you are somehow a bad person, you are somehow crazed in some way. But the true craziness and the true insanity comes from epistemic slavishness to official authorities without actually checking what those authorities say is the truth. And there is a sort of, and I want to introduce all of you to this concept, a sort of tyranny of the mind that comes with the way Mike Pence and others have attacked Vivek and attacked others who question these official narratives in their wake. There's a tyranny of the mind because in America, we are skeptical of the tyranny of politics, of tyranny of the flesh, tyranny that oppresses us, tyranny that violates our property rights, tyranny that takes our resources from us unjustly without compensation, tyranny which comes towards us at the barrel of a gun. And yet the tyranny of the mind is what we call private tyranny here in philosophy. And John Stuart Mill, who was great before he became a socialist, he mentioned that the biggest threat to liberty wasn't just the tyranny of the government, it was also private tyranny of individual actors in society that are independent of the government. Now, many of us would say today that the biggest expositors of private tyranny would be big tech. I would only agree in part because big tech, the only reason they're unable to do the kind of censorious behavior they do is because the government gives them so much money and so much subsidies that it isolates them from the corrective market forces, which under any other condition, absent of political interference, which is also unjust, by the way, they would be able to correct the excesses of these corporations. But that corrective has been eliminated because government has been involved in favoritism and involved in giving welfare to these corporations. So I will only agree in part that big tech is an example of this. But the biggest example of private tyranny, which ails the minds of Americans, is none other than the slavishness to official narratives. And this private tyranny reduces the mind's ability to understand the nature of reality for what it is and to pursue truth for what it is. And I'll get to this in a second as well. I'll explain more in a second. But think about how many people went along with the COVID-19 lockdowns without actually questioning not just the efficacy. I don't care about the efficacy. If an act is evil, it is evil whether it is efficient or inefficient. Efficiency is separate from evil. I want you all who look at efficiency as a means to judge the value of something to break from that bind, because that's a bind put on you by this sort of positivistic mindset that says we can reduce the entire world to data, the entire world to statistics. No, 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 no. We understand by virtue of having moral premises, by virtue of having first principles, that evil is evil no matter what result it produces. But few people during the COVID lockdowns wanted to question the morality, the ethics of what the experts were doing to the American people. They had literally a blank check to do not only to the American people, but what they did in Britain and in Australia, where in Australia teenagers were arrested simply for doing the human act of going out and appreciating nature. You couldn't even appreciate nature anymore without it being a danger to the public good, this sort of collectivist idea, and then you being sacrificed to that public good. Your safety, everything being sacrificed to that. That is what it was. That is a sign of an unhealthy culture. And that is a sign of when the mind has been degraded by a mental tyranny. Vivek is talking about the mental tyranny of unquestioning, blind, slavish adherence to ideas that, even though they have shaped the destiny of our nation, are considered untouchable. But if we're going to really pursue the truth, nothing is untouchable and everything is fair game. All right, enough on that point. Now, Vivek goes into talking about the old world and how the old world, before the American Revolution, had this perspective of the truth and of the human being that was rather cynical and bad. I'll put this right here.
So when you describe the way that people who run the country feel about voters, you're describing the way parents treat small children.
That's right. That's right. I think that's actually worth understanding, because there's one school of thought that says the government and the people in charge are fundamentally hostile to the people. If only it were so easy, actually. I think the reality of what's going on is far more dangerous, where the people who are in charge have actually what they think of as a benevolent view of the people, that we're doing what's actually right for you, for me, for the populace at large. And then if you look at this throughout history, Tucker, for most of human history, that's how it's been done. For most of human history, before 1776 in the old world, the vision was the people cannot be trusted to sort out their own differences. One person, one vote? That's such a laughable idea. It has to be church leaders and labor leaders and business leaders that decide in the back of palace halls what's right for the rest of society at large. And then we had this weird departure in 1776 that said, no. Actually, we the people can be trusted in a system where every person's voice and vote counts equally, with free speech and open debate in the public square, whatever it is. Sometimes we might get it wrong. Sometimes we get it right. But whatever it is, that's the way we do things in this new thing we call the United States of America. But then every once in a while, and we're in one of those moments, that ugly monster rears its head again that says, no. The people can't be trusted. It has to be now in the back of palace halls, in the back of three-letter government agencies in Washington, D.C., or in the back of BlackRock's corner office on Park Avenue in Manhattan, wherever it is. It's that the enlightened have to make sure that the public is protected from the truth, just like a parent protects a child. And I think it's that parental instinct. It's not the kidnapper's instinct, right? It's not the guy who wants to, kidnap and kill the child. No, it's actually almost what they think of as being the instinct of a parent who's doing for you what's better for you than you know for yourself. And I think that's what gives it actual staying power, because it's not what somebody thinks of as evil who's committing evil. They think of it as actually a moral obligation to the public, which explains the bipartisan nature of when somebody speaks the truth about what really happened on 9/11. No, hush, keep that under the rug, because Republican or Democrat, we know that the people can't be trusted for that. It's not good for the people.
The children are listening. Lower your voice.
The kids are listening.
Yeah.
Okay, now let me touch on this for a little bit, because I actually talk about old world Europe and the old world in general for a very long time. I've been talking about it for a very long time. Not only that, but I believe the old world still exists in many places in the world. When you have nations where your ability to speak is bound to this sort of theocratic idea of what the government believes is correct, and they falsely use religion to justify that, like in the Middle East, you have an old world mentality in full effect that is unfortunately in the 21st century. But in the old world, we have to understand, where did the old world come from? Where did this mentality that people, the average everyday person, was not fit for the truth? They were not fit for governance. They were not fit for politics. They were not fit to understand these higher ideas, and instead appointed leaders whose legitimacy was derived from status, and legitimacy was derived from caste. Remember, we had a society of status before America, a society of caste, which were oftentimes predestined before you were even born. That's where the legitimacy was established from. How do we get to this point? Well, Western philosophy and Western thinking, Western political thinking, goes all the way back to Plato. And if you look at Western political thinking seriously, it is a one long footnote to Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle comes along, and for the next few hundred to 1,000 years, Western political philosophy and Western, general philosophy is dominated by Aristotelianism, and Plato had just as much of a seismic effect. And so the idea that Plato had, and I think that Plato is actually the originator of all tyrannical philosophies in some way, shape, and form. He was the first one, at least. Of course, there are those that take different forms throughout history. But Plato, he began with the presumption that man was fit for certain classes, and there were certain static functions in the city that man was to fulfill, that he really couldn't go beyond, and that there would just be this one person who would actually master knowledge of philosophy and also master the practice of virtue, which for Plato was very important, and ascend through the ranks and then be able to tell you how to live your life, because he knew much better than you, because he mastered all those things that you, by virtue of your caste, by your virtue of your status, couldn't master. This was called, and you guys probably have heard it before, this was called the philosopher king, this benevolent dictator whose life, whose decisions determined your life, and your life was in his hands. You go over to Aristotle, you have a more subtle kind of tyranny, but this is the tyranny, as opposed to the single aristocrat, the tyranny of the community, where Aristotle says, hey, you can't be virtuous, you can't be a good person without other people involved in you being a good person, without sort of community there to channel your virtue through. Therefore, you should be bound to the expectations of the common good, of the community, and this is why in Aristotelian philosophy, the individual doesn't make any appearance. None of that makes any appearance. It's all about the community and the good of the common good above anything else. Now, we can go down the water hole into a deep discussion about, why individualism was not in ancient Greece, and I'm Christian, you're being unfair and uncharitable. I'm not. This is all historical record, by the way. And all the presumptions of Western political action follow from what I just said. Thomas Hobbes, which is more recent, had this strange idea, Leviathan, that human beings were just so nasty by our nature that the only way we can live peacefully is if there is a gun pointed to your head at all times that forces you to be obedient, forces you to be kind, as if you're like a bunch of kids in a playpen that need a nanny to make sure they are good people. This is the presumption of tyrannical philosophies, that there are some who know and some who don't know, and those who know are better positioned to rule over you than those who don't know, or even worse, those who know but don't know in the way that the ruling class wants them to know. That was the presumption of the old world, and that presumption rejected individualism, it rejected free thought, it rejected all of the moral requirements for true human flourishing, speak of that, and it placed them in this place of status. So when you hear people talk about the old world and how Vivek says that decisions were made in palaces and back rooms, well, because it was these people that presumably knew, who had, by virtue of them presumably knowing, the ability to control you. But the problem is, those who know, by nature of human knowledge, don't know totally, because no human being can know all things at all times. No one is omniscient. And so, since human knowledge is imperfect, how does it follow that an imperfect human can make perfect decisions because of his knowledge? The exact opposite follows. And during the Enlightenment, this became more realized. And writers like Algernon and Sidney and John Locke began questioning the presumption that had reigned over old world Europe that the king, that royalty, that status was higher than moral principle, was higher than the nature of truth and reality, was higher than individual thought and conscience. All things which, by the way, are requirements for any functioning society, any functioning life. And when they challenged that, Algernon and Sidney, who came before Locke, was actually killed for challenging status. Because the people who thought they knew didn't really know anything except what was advantageous to their continued political rulership over you and I. Now, what does that sound like today? Vivek, when we talk about the old world, it's so important to understand that status was the organizing principle. America was a departure from the old world because America put the locus of moral value in the individual. America followed the standard Christianity had set thousands of years before its formation, whereas Christianity was the first monotheistic religion which said no, as opposed to the group or the religious class being valuable. The individual, by virtue of the relationship with their capacity to form a relationship under their own free will with God, that's valuable. And that's what Protestant Christianity really swept forth. I'm flowing here, but let me stop because I don't want to get too far from the topic. But the old world is characterized by placing status over the individual and presuming those within status know and those who aren't within status don't know, which creates this problem of imperfection. And the new world is characterized by sort of placing everyone on the same playing field, saying that by virtue of your humanity, you have certain qualities that are inalienable, that are intractable, and are necessary for the flourishing of any society. That is so important, and Vivek is doing a good service by touching on that right there. So the foreign policy stuff, I'll touch on this very briefly. Vivek mentions how for the foreign policy, his foreign policy, which has been criticized as being pro-Putin or everything, is seen as weak by some people. Go.
And so my view is, let's think about first term in office as it relates to this dimension of foreign policy. End the Ukraine war on terms that help pull Russia out of China's hands. That's going to require rebuilding a lot of trust. I think I'm up for that job. And I believe that Putin can trust us to follow our self-interest as long as we trust him to follow his. Reopen economic relations with Russia, freeze the current lines of control, make a permanent commitment that NATO will not admit Ukraine to NATO. But in return, weaken, if not disband, that Russia-China alliance. I'd get India back on side. And, if there's a guy who's going to rebuild trust with India, it better be a guy with the name Vivek Ramaswamy who might be up for that task. But, getting India on side to say, you know what, we're going to be making sure that in a conflict situation in Taiwan, that we're at least on side with the United States. But then more importantly, get semiconductor self-sufficiency in the United States, reduce our economic dependence on China. If we're there by the end of my first term, by the end of 2028, the stakes are now just a lot lower with respect to what's actually happening in Taiwan. And if, is it preferable for China to annex Taiwan even after that scenario? No, probably not. But that's a different bar for whether or not we're going to actually be willing to send our sons and daughters to die over it. And in the meantime, there's one aspect of our national defense that surprisingly nobody's talking about, Tucker, which is actually our national defense of the homeland, where we have actually badly missed the plot for super EMP attacks, cyber attacks, nuclear defense. We helped Israel build an Iron Dome. How about an equivalent of an Iron Dome for the United States and our own homeland? And so that's where I'm focused in my first term. On foreign policy, if I can get us to semiconductor independence, if I can get us to significantly reduced, if not total economic independence from China, weaken the Russia-China alliance by ending the war in Ukraine, that actually keeps China at bay from not having an economic gun to our head over our modern way of life, at which point we then have a different set of commitments where after that, we're going to be in good shape no matter what happens. And so I wasn't, planning to get into some foreign policy detour, but that's the way I'm thinking about the first term.
That all of that makes sense.
You think so?
Well, I'm not sure what is controversial about any of that.
Well, I think what's controversial about it is they say
how
it's weak.
Far those priority. It's weak.
That's what I heard yesterday. Yeah, I mean,
from whom?
Well, from a lot of Republicans actually. And
is there a dumber group? I mean, then the foreign policy Republicans. I mean, I'm not talking about Republican voters. I mean, the members of Congress, the low IQ guys from, including your state, I hate to say it, Texas, who make their entire career about seeming strong and quoting Reagan, and under whose watch the country has become demonstrably weaker.
Okay, and he also mentions that he is criticized for not having a lot of foreign policy experience. Let me say something very quickly, my friends. If you the more experience you have, the more damage you can do. I'm being quite literal with this. The more experience you have, the more ways you know how to destroy something. It's also true you know more ways as well on how to fix things and maintain things. But experience by itself is not of value. And oftentimes, Western minds and American political minds have sacrificed themselves, sacrificed their integrity towards the cult of experience. Oh, how much experience does this guy have in government before I can make him president? Really? Because you understand that the people in our country right now that have the most experience are doing the most damage to us. And that not all experience is good experience. I would prefer the man who has ideas, but not the experience to back them up, to a man who has experience, but lacks moral principles and ideas, who is willing to use his sort of pragmatic, cold, calculating political calculation to sell America down the river whenever it benefits him. Because that is oftentimes what happens when you become a creature of the political system. When you become a creature of the political system, your experience is oftentimes used as a tool to win you more context, win you more power, and erode the ability of the American people to have a corrective and control over their government. So I don't care if Vivek has not sat on the board of the Council of Foreign Relations for 20 years, like some of the people who have gotten us into all these endless wars and have tied us up with globalism have. I don't give a damn. I care about his ideas. And that just makes me so angry because people literally sacrifice themselves. They sacrifice their intellect to these dry, static, nonsense narratives, and they get shocked when you question them, and they accuse you of hating America, they accuse you of being weak because they can't reflect on the weakness within themselves. They're projecting. They can't reflect on the weakness within themselves, within their own ideas, because they refuse to do that very important process of self-evaluation. Once again, I'm not saying you can't criticize Vivek's foreign policy. Of course you can. But do so on the correct grounds. Don't do so because you are unwilling to test your own premises. Let me say this really quickly. Very quickly. The biggest distinction between the old world and the new world was the willingness of the people in any of those eras to question the premises, question the worldviews they were under. The people who lived in the feudal system in Europe, whose entire life's destinies was predetermined by some fox system that did nothing but create more human misery and poverty and empower those at the very top. They didn't question the premises of their system necessarily. The people who lived in pre-colonial America, where all manner of practices that we would consider barbaric today, because of our correct moral understanding, were practiced, like putting someone's mouth and with a spike because they gossip or whatever. Or, for example, before the Revolutionary War, allowing the king's soldiers to come into your house, or not allowing, being forced to, having undying loyalty towards the British Empire, which is what even some American founders had, by the way, and which is why they didn't all of them didn't sign the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. All that stuff would have been considered rather normal. But the American Revolution was the greatest negation of the false premises of the previous generations. I mean, the truth is rather simple. It was the unquestioned premises of the old world Europe that kept man away from his potential for so many eons. When you were born into the feudal system, serfdom was presumed, never questioned. When you were born into a monarchical system, the divinity or the divine sovereignty of the king was presumed and never questioned. Imagine what would have happened if man, sooner than 1776, sooner than the establishment of America, came to a realization that all of these presumptions were actually hampering the truth, hampering his own potential, and he broke that yoke hundreds of years before America was ever formed. Imagine that happened. Imagine how advanced we would have been as a world if human potential had its necessary conditions before America. But America was so different because America did question the premise. And not only did America question the premise, it rejected the premise, but rejected it in a way that is sustainable and has lasted over a few centuries. And that is something that most countries in the world can't even say. Most countries, as part of their foundations, can't even say. The difference between an old world society and a new world society is the willingness of the people to embrace rationality as a value. And so we have to ask ourselves, what in our current society has been unquestioned premises that have dominated the minds? Well, trust the science was one, where people were literally coaxed into disregarding ethical and moral thinking and critical thinking in general for uncritical allegiance to the scientific authorities who were co-opted by political interests, which produced devastating lockdowns and so many other endless consequences that we will be filling for generations upon generations. The idea, the 9/11 Commission, or the Warren Commission, or any other narrative put out by the government is official and cannot be questioned without the presumption of insanity on behalf of the questioner, is another old world premise that binds so many people from reaching their full potential and understanding the truth and just how dark and dirty the United States government is and the political order that rules us, the uniparty. I can keep going on and on and on. But we're on the topic of premises, right? What is the premise, going back to the Vivek thing, of American foreign policy and foreign involvement in recent history? Well, going all the way back to World War II, post-World War II, the premise was that America and the European nations were going to be the vanguard against the excesses of communism, and they were going to prevent future instances of dictatorial fascism, like we saw with Nazi Germany. Well, what actually happened was the USSR and the Western states were locked in this geopolitical battle that was drawn out. A lot of money was spent. A lot of shadow campaigns were orchestrated around the world to overthrow governments, to flood certain countries with weapons, to beat each other in a way that would have advanced the geopolitical interests of either party. But once the USSR collapsed, and Americans realized that we actually gained more from trading and partaking in relations with those we may disagree with philosophically, as opposed to hating them and feeling war and violence, well, immediately what happened there, the project that was foisted onto America after World War II immediately shifted. It immediately shifted, and it had to be preserved by the interests who had an interest in keeping the world in this sort of geopolitical tense struggle. Because there are those, of course, that had something to gain. Imagine, America has not had a moment of peace since World War II. We have always been in some kind of armed conflict. We've always been funding some kind of armed conflict, some kind of coup around the world. We have not had a moment of peace since World War II because we've sacrificed our foreign policy interests to the interest of global nations, the interest of globalist interests, as opposed to the interests of American national sovereignty. Now, this was almost attempted before World War II, during World War I, after which the League of Nations was proposed to America. She rejected it and said no, because the interest of some external force beyond our borders is not our interest. But NATO and the Atlantic Council, the United Nations, all which kind of emerged after World War II, have not only birthed America's globalist foreign policy interests, they have kept her there, they have kept her spending money, they have kept her driving destruction around the world, and they have kept her bound to this false premise, which animated the Bush era and animates the sentiments of neoconservatives today, that says that American interests don't rest in our borders, they rest hundreds of thousands of miles away in Ukraine, they rest in Afghanistan, and they rest in exporting our brand of quote-unquote democracy to other countries with bombs and guns, as opposed to remaining a country that is truly sovereign and that minds their own business and exports nothing more than voluntary trade and peaceful interaction abroad. The neoconservative presumption is the same presumption America was placed under after World War II. And it's the same presumption that Vivek Ramaswamy is rejecting in his foreign policy by saying that our national self-interest matters. But I'll go even a step further. There is not a moral presumption made by those in this camp. Because people say that if you don't want to be a constant force of terror and chaos in the world, you are somehow projecting weakness. But you know what is truly weak? What is truly weak is routing the energies of a nation into a wholly unproductive process, which causes a massive opportunity cost and causes destruction that produces nothing, which is called war, and saying that is strength. That is not strength. Weakening the moral fortitude of a nation is not strength. Depleting a nation's scarce resources in the name of globalist interests is not strength. It is weakness. And fundamentally, a nation having no moral obligation to its people, or a nation not answering the moral obligation it has to its people, to consider them before they consider anyone else in their foreign affairs, is also not strength. It's weakness of the mind, because it shows just how terribly American foreign policy lacks a foundation. And if you lack a foundation, you cannot stand. Nothing without a foundation is strong. So this idea of strength, peace through strength, which means we're going to go finance shadow campaigns around the world, we're going to go spend more money on Ukraine than we do on Maui, and that's actually a conversation right now happening in Congress. We're going to go and try to overthrow dictators to export our idea of democracy. We're going to go and install dictators into places, and then when they rebel against us like Gaddafi did, kill them, and that's going to be strength? No. That's the antithesis of moral strength. That's the antithesis of geopolitical strength, and that is an insult to our national sovereignty. Now, before I get going, because I've dragged you guys through this a long time, I must say, Vivek is the reason why Chris Christie and Mike Pence and all these folks don't like Vivek is because Vivek is saying, he's calling back to that first principle foundation of the nation having a moral obligation to its people and only to its people and not to these globalist interests. That's why he's jarring, because he's literally challenging the premise that our foreign policy has been under for the past 50, 60, 70, 80 years. And what we know about people who challenge premises is that if they challenge the premise and they replace it with something that is sustainable and that is correct and that is true, they have just unlocked a wave of potential. And the established interests don't like that. That's why Vivek's foreign policy is being opposed by the neocons and by those in power who have an interest in America continuing to be aggressive, continuing to export democracy and all that other nonsense, which has done nothing more than erode our nation's moral foundations. Now, the last part I want to go over is Vivek's encounter with this pansexual person. This is interesting, and that Tucker Bench, let's go.
To the first thing, trans is fundamentally in tension with gay. I've not heard anybody say that in public. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's just starting with the L and the G. Most lesbians don't like gay men and vice versa. But then now you keep adding.
I don't think you can say that. It's too true.
And you sort of like further start playing this out.
Wait.
Trans is this totally weird separate thing. That's like, so like, you're just like mashing this like alphabet soup just to create an us versus them destruction of modern order.
Sorry, I should say I someone in the studio is nodding. Who would know? What you just said is true.
It's the truth. I mean, really. And so, you know, the truth is, let's just take, I mean, we could have a lot of fun with this one, but just take some of the suppositions here and see if this logically makes sense, right? Like one of the suppositions in the gay rights movement, which, you know, I'm totally open to this, but it's just partly of how we created gay rights in this country, is that the sex of the person you're attracted to is hardwired on the day you're born, even though there is no gay gene. Now, if you make it one movement, the LGBT movement, that's the same movement that also now says that your own sex is completely fluid over the course of your life, even though there is a definitive sex chromosome. Like, you can't believe these two things at the same time. They're fundamentally
nonsensical.
It's nonsensical.
Now, Vivek makes an interesting point. There is a presumption of biological reality to the idea of homosexuality and homosexuality, but at the same time, there's also this presumption that society constructs these meanings when you get into the idea of ideological transgenderism. I make the distinction between transgenderism and ideological transgenderism for a few reasons. Number one, someone merely being a transgender is a form of expression. There are thousands of forms of expression known to the human condition. It's called culture. It's called music. It's called art. There are so many different ways that human beings have found to use their faculties of reason to express themselves in a way that is excellent or in a way that is pleasing to them. So if someone wishes to express themselves in that long tradition of the human condition of self-expression, that's none of my business. But transgenderism or any form of expression becomes ideological when personal expression is held to be the truth for all. And then, not only is it held to be the truth for all, it is held to be the indispensable truth for all that should be enforced and inflicted upon the innocent by policy, by coercion, by force on both an institutional level, a societal level, and a political level. That's what gender ideology has done. It has co-opted the virtue of expression, turned it into a vice, and then tried to pair that vice with governmental mechanisms to suppress dissent, and therefore put us in an old world state. I'm giving you guys fruit right now. Put you in an old world state where the premise is unquestioned, your potential is weakened, and your proper moral understanding is also in defect. You see? Anyone who talks about transgenderism but does not differentiate between ideological transgenderism and actual, just expression, is doing you a disservice. They have no fruit, they are a cloud with no rain, and they want to make you mad. I want to give you something to think about, and then to take that and apply it to the future. So that's an interesting presumption there. That's that sort of separation. But also, it also comes to the point where there's just a difference in worldviews. Sexuality has been hijacked by the power fetishists, the people, the woke, that believe that everything in society is reduced to some kind of conflict, some kind of power dynamic, and that if you can understand or take advantage of that dynamic, you can therefore alter society in your image and do so righteously to beat oppression. This is the entire idea of the second wave feminist emphasis on the personal is political. It's the idea that even the family, even the traditional family, is just some power structure meant to hold women down, and therefore women should politicize everything in their personal lives and overthrow that structure by pushing for societal change and doing so through the mechanism of government. This is the inversion of values and meaning and understanding of the proper dimensions of political authority that has swept our culture, informed thinking and the academy, and informed public policy in many cases. It's a perversion. It is bad. It is not good. It is not sound. And yet it has overtaken many of our sensibilities in the nation and created old world premises that keep us bound to these sacred cows that we have. That's a problem. And sexuality is a victim, almost, a useful tool of people who hold this impoverished worldview. Which is why Americanism is so important, my friends. It's why the American emphasis on natural law, natural rights that flow from that natural law, objective reality, reason as a value, the individual as the primary focus of moral authority, all these things are so exceptionally important because they provide a buffer against the anti-human, anti-reality ideas provided to us by forces that seek to tear America down every day. Now, Vivek did great in this interview. I want you guys to go ahead and watch it on Carlson's Twitter page, his X page or whatever, or other places where you can find the interview that's been reposted. And I want all of you to consider something. As an American, what duty do you have not only to yourself, but to the truth? As an American, what duty do you have to be more contemplative and more thoughtful about the condition of our world in relation to the existence of America? As an American, what duty do you have to cultivate sound critical thinking by using reason as a value? I think you have an indispensable duty to all of those things. A duty that's secondary, of course, but it's still quite important. Which is why I encourage all of you to please join me in the revolution of the mind. It is time to allow the fires of philosophy and the fires of pensiveness to sweep this country once more, challenge these premises that hold us back, and unlock something within ourselves that will bring us forth to this 1776 moment that Vivek mentioned in this interview. So my friends, if you want to help me support me in this mission, you can like this video, comment on this video, share this video, subscribe to my channel. But if you really want to support me, please, 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 please donate to my Patreon, donate to my PayPal, donate to my locals, christianwatson.locals.com, my Buy Me a Coffee. Help me financially so I can keep bringing content like this to you at all times of the day. And additionally, join our Discord community to be a part of something bigger than any of us. Hopefully that will outlive generations, the revolution of the mind. My friends, love you guys so much. Thank you for watching. Study philosophy, study history, stay morally convicted, and most importantly, please stay pensive. Bye, everyone.